My name is Isabel Moreno. Everyone calls me Belle. I am 37 years old, and on a Sunday evening in April, at the dinner table in my mother's apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, my mother set down her water glass, looked at me with the specific warmth she uses when she has decided something is a good idea and wants me to agree with it, and said, "I've been thinking about selling this place. I think it might be time for me to move in with you." My brother Marco, sitting to her left, nodded as if this had already been discussed and ratified somewhere I wasn't present. My sister Cammie, across from him, was looking at her phone but added, "That makes so much sense, honestly. She'd be so much closer to everything." My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. She said, "You've always been the one I could count on, Mija. You've always been there." I looked at her hand on mine. I looked at Marco's nod. I looked at Camel's phone. I looked at the 4 plates of food on the table that I had driven 45 minutes to bring because my mother's kitchen had been struggling with an appliance issue for 2 weeks and nobody else in the family had organized a solution. I looked at all of it, and I felt something that had been compressed for a very long time reach a pressure that the container I had built for it could no longer hold. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it back down. And I said, "Before we talk about that, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been keeping to myself for the past year, and I need everyone to hear it because it changes the shape of this conversation." The table went quiet. My mother's hand was still on mine. Marco stopped nodding. "Cammie put down her phone," I told them. "Before I take you into what I said at that table, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe only if the story is already reaching somewhere real inside you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing who is listening." Now let me take you back. Because what happened at my mother's dinner table on a Sunday in April did not begin that evening, and it did not begin the year before, when I first started keeping the thing I was keeping. It began 20 years earlier, when a 17-year-old girl watched her father pack 2 suitcases and understood, in the specific, pre-verbal way that adolescents understand things before they have language for them, that the weight of this family had just been redistributed, and that she was the one standing closest to the center of it when it landed. My father, Eduardo Moreno, left on a Wednesday in October when I was 17, Marco was 12, and Cammie was 6 years old. He did not leave dramatically. There was no shouting, no final confrontation, no scene that could be pointed to as the moment. He left the way some people leave, which is quietly and completely, with the luggage packed while my mother was at work and a note on the kitchen counter that said he needed something different and that he hoped we would understand eventually. He moved to Florida. He remarried within 2 years. He has 3 children with his second wife children. I have met exactly 4 times at awkward holiday attempts that eventually stopped being attempted. He is not a monster. He is a man who wanted something other than what he had and who chose it without the courage of an honest conversation first. I have made a kind of peace with that. What I have not made peace with entirely is what his leaving set in motion for the rest of us. My mother, Rosa Moreno, is the kind of woman who holds herself together through the force of dignity rather than the presence of resources. She is small and precise and has a particular warmth, the kind that fills a room by being specific rather than general, that asks you the question nobody else thought to ask and remembers the answer 6 months later without being reminded. She has, over 64 years, bent circumstances that would have broken other people, not by fighting them dramatically, but by refusing to be governed by them, which is a different and in some ways harder thing to do. After my father left, she held herself together with that refusal, working her job as a billing coordinator at a medical group in Silver Spring, managing a household of 3 children on a single income, presenting to the world the version of herself that needed no one's pity and was managing perfectly well, because to present any other version would have felt to her like a concession to Eduardo's departure, and she was not going to make that concession. She was managing, in the ways that were visible. The 3 of us ate, we were clothed, we got to school on time with signed permission slips and appropriate shoes for the season. She made it to parent-teacher conferences, and she asked follow-up questions at those conferences that indicated she had been paying attention. She was present for the visible requirements of a parent in a way that I have never, not once, stopped being grateful for, because I know children in similar circumstances who did not have what we had in that department. What suffered was the margin, the financial margin that turns a workable household into a stable one, the margin that covers the car repair when it arrives unannounced, the medical bill that shows up in a month when everything else is already accounted for, the school trip that costs $300 and has a deadline, the emotional margin that allows a parent to be fully present with their children rather than perpetually managing the next obligation in the queue, and the long-term margin, the kind that accumulates into retirement savings and emergency funds, and the structural ability to absorb a crisis without the crisis immediately becoming a catastrophe. My mother's margin in all three of these dimensions was thin after my father left. Thin in the specific, quiet way that middle-class struggling is thin, not visibly, not in ways that showed up on the surface of daily life, but in the underneath of it, in the accounting. I understood this before Marco or Cammy did. Not because I was smarter or more perceptive, but because I was the oldest, and the oldest always sees the books first, always catches the note of constraint in a voice a few years before the younger ones have developed the ear for it. I started working at 17, the autumn my father left. A part-time job at a pharmacy near our apartment 20 hours a week, which was the maximum I could hold alongside school. I gave most of it to my mother, not because she asked me to, but because I looked at the spreadsheet of her expenses one evening when she was putting Cammy to bed, and I understood what the numbers said, and I could not unknow them once I'd seen them. She found out I was contributing. I was depositing directly to the household account, and she cried, which was one of only 4 times I can remember my mother crying in my presence. She said, "You shouldn't have to do this," I said. "I know." We did not discuss it further. I kept depositing. That was the beginning. Not a decision I made consciously, not a role I applied for a position I stepped into because the position was open and I was standing closest to it. I have spent 20 years trying to understand whether I would make the same choice again, and the honest answer is that I don't know. The 17-year-old version of me would. Whether the version of me that exists now, with 20 years of accumulated understanding of what that choice cost, would make it again, that is a more complicated question. I want to be precise about what the 8 years I'm going to describe actually look like, because the stories we tell about family sacrifice tend toward the general, and the general is easier to hear than the specific. I'm going to give you the specific. I graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in public health, with scholarship funding covering most of my costs and a part-time job covering the remainder. I did not ask my mother for money during college. I got a job at a nonprofit focused on global health policy in Washington, D.C., 3 months after graduation, a program coordinator role that paid well enough for a 22-year-old and that I was good at from the beginning in the specific way that people are good at work that is actually aligned with what they are. I moved into a studio apartment in Tacoma Park. I had, for the first time, something resembling a budget that was only mine, and for approximately 8 months, I existed inside that budget without it being redistributed. Then Marco's first round of trouble started. I will not detail the full arc of my brother's addiction here, because it is his story and not entirely mine to tell, and because the specifics are less important than the shape of what it required from the family over the following 6 years. What I will tell you is that Marco's addiction to prescription painkillers, which had begun in his late teens after a sports injury and which had gone significantly untreated for reasons related to cost and denial, and the specific difficulty that the people who love an addict have in naming what they are looking at when they're inside it, arrived in my life as a crisis in my first year out of college. There was a night, a hospitalization, a conversation with a counselor who used words that reorganized the family's understanding of what had been happening and what was going to be required to address it. What was required was money first. Rehabilitation is not free. The good facilities are very much not free. My mother did not have the resources to cover a meaningful program. Marco did not have insurance that would cover the level of care the counselor recommended. My father, when contacted, contributed a check for an amount I will not specify except to say that it was less than a month's worth of my rent at the time, and that he did not follow up to ask how the process went. I covered the remainder of the first residential program, 42 days. I am telling you this not because I want credit for it. I made the choice with full awareness and I do not regret the substance of it, but because it is the beginning of the financial accounting that would define the next 8 years. and the accounting matters for the rest of this story. Marco completed the program. He relapsed 18 months later. He completed a second program, shorter this time, at a facility I also contributed to significantly. He has been in recovery for 4 years now. He is working. He is in a relationship with a woman who knows his history and loves him anyway, which I think is the right kind of love for someone in recovery to have. He is the best version of himself that I have seen in his adult life, and I am genuinely proud of him, and what it cost to get there was real. And I paid most of it, and I am trying to hold both of those things simultaneously without letting one erase the other. During those same years, Cami was in high school and then approaching college age, and the question of how college was going to be funded arrived with the specific urgency of a deadline that had been visible from a distance for years and that nonetheless surprised everyone when it finally arrived. My mother's income had not grown in pace with what the applications required. There were federal loans, a small grant from the university, and a gap. I covered the gap. I did this for 4 years, a monthly contribution that I restructured my own budget around, adjusting my savings rate and deferring purchases I had been planning and not going on the trip to Portugal I had been saving toward for 2 years. Cami graduated last spring. She does not know the full number. I do not know whether to tell her. Through all of this, my mother's health was its own ongoing negotiation. She was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease in her late 50s, a diagnosis that required management, medication, regular appointments, dietary adjustments, and the kind of logistical support that a chronic illness requires from the people around the person who has it. I became that person by default. Not because Marco and Cami were unwilling, they were not, in the abstract, but because I was the one who lived closest, who had the most stable schedule, who had the deepest understanding of the medical system from my professional work, and who had, over 20 years, become the person the family oriented toward when something needed to be done. I drove her to appointments. I managed her prescription refills. I researched her dietary protocols and made her a guide that her nephrologist complimented, which I mention only because my mother showed the guide to everyone in her medical practice, and I want you to understand that I did it with love and not with resentment, even when the resentment was also there. The money I spent over 8 years, if I added it accurately, would be a number that would surprise most people who know me and stagger most people who don't. I am not going to give you the full number here. I will tell you that I looked at it once, in a spreadsheet I made on a February evening 3 years ago, and I sat with it for a long time, and then I closed the spreadsheet and did not open it again. Not because the number was unbearable, because the number was so large that looking at it directly made it real in a way that required me to ask what I had gotten in return, and I was not ready to ask that question. There are things I lost during those years that were not financial, and I want to tell you about them because they are the hardest part of this story to see from the outside, and the part I believe matters most to anyone who is listening from inside a version of it. I lost a relationship. His name was Daniel, and I was with him for 3 years, and he was one of the genuinely good people I have encountered in my adult life, patient and funny, and specifically interested in me in the way that people are interested when they are paying real attention rather than performing it. He did not compete with my family explicitly. He was careful never to frame things that way, and I think the carefulness was genuine rather than strategic. He never said, "You love them more than you love me." He never said, "Why are they always the first thing?" He simply, over time, stopped filling the spaces I kept leaving empty, because the spaces were always there, and they were always the same shape, the shape of whatever the family needed that week, and at some point, a person stops being able to build a shared life in a space that is never fully available. He moved to Boston for a research position in the second year we were together. The position was significant for him, and he did not ask me to follow him, because by that point we both understood that following him would require me to leave the orbit of a family whose needs had become the primary organizing principle of my schedule, my attention, and the parts of myself I had to give. We tried long distance for 8 months. The 8 months were honest about what the relationship had been working around. When we could not be physically present with each other, what remained was 2 people who loved each other and whose lives were not pointed in the same direction. We stopped trying on a Sunday in March. I drove home from his apartment and I sat in my car outside my building for 45 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, and then I went upstairs and I called my mother because she had a question about a prescription refill, and I answered the question and I made dinner and I went to bed. I did not cry until the following Saturday when I had enough unscheduled time to feel it. I have not been in a serious relationship since Daniel. I have offered myself several versions of why this is, not all of them honest. The most honest version is this. I do not know how to exist as a person whose primary orientation is toward her own life and her own happiness. Because for 20 years there has always been a version of the family's needs available to occupy the space where that orientation would go, and I have used those needs consciously sometimes, unconsciously more often, as a reason not to do the harder work of deciding what I want and going toward it without asking anyone's permission first. Geneva is part of the answer to that. I am curious about the rest of the answer. I am going to find out. I also lost, or more accurately deferred for so long that deferral became its own kind of loss, the professional ambitions that had animated my work every day for 8 years without ever quite being permitted to become primary. I am good at my job better than good, in the specific way of someone whose work is aligned with both her values and her particular capacities. I can look at the gap between what a health initiative was designed to do and what it is actually doing in the communities it serves and see, with unusual precision, where the misalignment lives and what would close it. I have been recognized for this by people whose recognition I respect. I have been offered opportunities, positions, fellowships, research partnerships that I declined for reasons that always had the same underlying architecture. The opportunity required a commitment of time or location or uncertainty that I told myself the family's current situation could not absorb. The family's current situation was always in some state that could not absorb it. That was not a coincidence. It was a system I had built without understanding I was building it. The opportunity I am about to tell you about is the one I could not decline again. The one I had already declined twice before, and that had come back a third time in a form I did not have a legitimate reason to say no to, and that I had spent the previous 12 months trying to find a legitimate reason to say no to anyway, and failing, and finally understanding that the reason I had been looking for was not a reason. It was a habit. The habit of choosing the family first, second, and last, without asking whether the family or I would be well served by my continuing to make that choice. The World Health Organization's Global Health Systems Fellowship is a 3-year research and policy position based in Geneva, Switzerland. It is funded by a combination of WHO institutional resources and a private foundation that supports mid-career professionals in global health who have demonstrated both field expertise and research capacity. It is competitive in the way that things are competitive when the pool of applicants is large and specific and serious, and when I first applied for it 6 years ago, I did not get past the initial review, which was the correct outcome for where I was at that point in my development. I applied again 3 years later and made it to the final round and was not selected, and the feedback I received was substantive and specific, and I used it, which is what you do when you are serious about a thing. The third application, submitted 18 months ago, resulted in a selection notification that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October while I was on a conference call, and that I did not read until the call ended, and that I read twice before I allowed myself to understand what it said. I was being offered the fellowship, 3 years in Geneva, full funding, a research focus on health system resilience in low and middle-income countries, which is the specific intersection of work I have spent 8 years building toward. The organization would arrange a secondment for my current position. The start date was the following September. I did not tell anyone. I want to be precise about this. I told no one for 12 months. Not my mother, not Marco, not Cami, not my colleagues, though they could see something had shifted in me and asked about it, and I said I was processing something personal. Not my closest friend, Ingrid, who knew me well enough to know I was holding something and who gave me the space to hold it, because that is the kind of friend she is, and because she trusted that I would tell her when I was ready. I did not tell them because I did not know what telling them would cost, and I was afraid the cost would be more than I could manage. My mother's health was in a stable but fragile state, and her apartment, which she rented, had recently had a rent increase that had made her monthly numbers difficult again. Marco was 8 months into his recovery from the second relapse, and the support structures around that recovery were still being built. Cami was in her 3rd year of college, and the tuition contributions were still ongoing. The timing was wrong. The timing was always wrong. That eventually became the affirmation. There's a specific moment when you understand that the timing will never be right. Not because the circumstances won't change, but because you will keep finding the circumstances that make the timing wrong, and you will keep finding them because you have spent 20 years building an identity around the finding of them. The moment of understanding is quiet. It does not arrive with drama or clarity. It arrives the way a lot of important things arrive, which is in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, while you are doing something that has nothing to do with it, and suddenly you know something you have been almost knowing for a long time, and the almost falls away. My almost fell away on a Tuesday in February, 8 months before the dinner. I was driving to my mother's apartment to take her to a nephrology appointment. The radio was on a station I don't usually listen to. I was thinking about nothing in particular, and I understood, in the clear, unassailable way of something that has been true for a while and has finally become visible, that I was going to Geneva, not that I wanted to go, not that I was considering going, that I was going, that I had always been going. That the 12 months of looking for a reason to say no had been 12 months of preparing myself to say yes. The decision had been made somewhere underneath everything else I had been doing, and I had been waiting to catch up to it. I called the fellowship coordinator the following morning and confirmed my acceptance. I deferred the start date by 6 months from the original September to the following March, which they permitted, which gave me 9 months from the February morning to the April dinner where I finally said the words out loud. I want to tell you about those 9 months between February and the April dinner, because they were not simple and did not proceed in a straight line, and I think the shape of them matters for anyone who is in the middle of a similar in-between and trying to understand what it takes to get from the decision to the saying of it. The first 3 months were almost entirely practical. I am a planner by nature and by training, and the way I process large decisions is by building the infrastructure around them before I have to inhabit the decision itself. I spent those months researching what my absence would mean for every moving part of the family's situation and building solutions for each one before I announced the problem. I researched patient advocate services in Silver Spring and found one that specialized in coordinating care for patients with chronic kidney disease, someone who could do, on a professionally compensated basis, what I had been doing for 6 years on a familial and uncompensated one. I met with the advocate twice before the dinner. She was thorough and experienced, and my mother would be in good hands, which was the only thing that mattered about that decision. I ran the fellowship stipend against my current financial commitments and built 3 different scenarios, one where I continued contributing at the same level, one where I contributed at 50%, and one where I stopped contributing and redirected the family toward the structural supports that already existed and that we had not been accessing because my covering of the gap had made accessing them feel unnecessary. The third scenario, which I had initially drafted as a baseline, turned out when I looked at it closely to be the most honest, because what it revealed was that the family had resources available to them: assistance programs, subsidized services, Marco's growing ability to contribute to shared costs, that had never been pursued because I had made them unnecessary. I had not meant to create a dependency. I had simply solved problems as they arrived, and the solving had prevented the family from developing the muscle to solve them independently. I researched housing in Geneva with the specific, absorbed attention that I bring to research when the subject is something I actually want. I found a neighborhood. I looked at apartments in a price range the stipend would support. I found a colleague from a previous conference who was Geneva-based and who agreed to coffee via video call and who told me about the specific rhythms of the city and the places to go and the things that surprised her when she arrived. These conversations, conducted in the evenings on my laptop in my apartment in Tacoma Park, were the moments in those 9 months when Geneva stopped being an idea and started being a place I was going to, and the shift that happened in my chest when it became real was the most certain I had felt about anything in years. In month 4, I told Ingrid, I had been waiting until the practical infrastructure was far enough along that I could present the decision alongside its architecture, rather than presenting the decision alongside its architecture, rather than presenting the decision alone and having the conversation be about whether I should make it. Ingrid listened with the quality of attention she always brings, which is complete and unhurried and does not perform anything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been waiting a long time for you to say something like this. She said, you have been disappearing into the family's needs for as long as I've known you, and I've watched it happen and not said anything because it wasn't my place to say it and because I knew you had to arrive here yourself. She said, Geneva is exactly right. I said, I know. She said, do you actually know it? Or do you know it with the part of you that's still looking for a reason to say no? I thought about it. I said, I actually know it. She said, good. Then let's talk about what you need to make it real. In month 6, I wrote the dinner speech, an actual document revised over 2 weeks. I wrote it because I have learned over 37 years of being someone who does not always trust herself to say the important things in real time, that writing the important things first and revising them until they are exactly right and then saying them is a more reliable process than arriving at a high-stakes conversation without preparation and hoping clarity arrives under pressure. It usually does not. I wrote what I wanted to say about the fellowship, about what I had been carrying, about the arrangements I had made, about what I needed from the family going forward. I revised the tone repeatedly. I did not want to be accusatory, because accusation was not the point and would derail the conversation before it had what it needed to go. I did not want to be apologetic, because I had spent 20 years being apologetic about my own needs by omission, and the first explicit statement of those needs was not going to begin with an apology. I wanted to be clear and honest and specific and present. I read it aloud to myself in my apartment twice, which felt both theatrical and completely necessary. In month 8, I arranged the dinner. Sunday evening at my mother's, I brought the food. I drove 45 minutes. I set the table with the care I bring to all of it, the same care I have always brought, because the care is not something I am leaving behind when I go. And then my mother said she had been thinking about selling her apartment and moving in with me, and Marco nodded and Cammy looked at her phone, and my mother's hand was warm on mine, and I understood that the moment I had spent 9 months building toward had arrived in the shape of a sentence I had not expected, and that there was not going to be a better moment than this one, and I set down my fork. What I told them was this. I said, for the past 12 months, I have been offered and have accepted a research fellowship at the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. It begins in March. It lasts 3 years. It is the opportunity I have been working toward for most of my career, and the reason I have stayed in this specific field instead of moving to something more lucrative or less demanding. I am going. I have decided. I am not telling you this to ask permission. I am telling you this because you are my family and you deserve to know the truth of what my life actually looks like, which I have not been fully honest about. My mother's hand went still on mine. I kept going. I said, I want to tell you some other things that are also true. I have been contributing financially to this family for the past 8 years in ways that none of you fully know about. I have covered most of Marco's 2 rehabilitation programs. I have contributed to Cammy's college tuition every semester for 4 years. I have paid for various expenses related to managing Mom's health that I have not itemized or asked to be reimbursed for, because that is not how I wanted to relate to this family. I am not telling you these things now to present a bill. I am telling you because I want us to be in a conversation about real things, and the real things include what I have been carrying and the fact that I cannot continue carrying it in the same way from Geneva for 3 years. The table was very quiet. I said, I have arranged, or am in the process of arranging, support structures for everything I have been managing personally. There is a patient advocate who will coordinate Mom's care. I have found information about a financial assistance program for Mom's rent situation that she qualifies for that none of us looked into before, because I was handling the gap myself and didn't require us to look. Marco, you have your support network and your sponsor and Luciana, and you are stronger than you have been in years, and you do not need me to be your safety net the way you needed me to be 5 years ago. Cammy, you graduate in May and you are going to be fine. And I have a conversation I want to have with you separately about what the next year looks like, because some of what I have not told you about how college was funded is information you should have. My mother had not moved. She was looking at me with the expression I had seen on her face 4 times in my life, the expression that accompanied the things that came from somewhere real and involuntary. Her eyes were bright. I said, Last, Mom, I love you. I will always love you. I will come back from Geneva. I will call you. I will visit. I will remain your daughter and this family's daughter in every way that matters. What I cannot do is be the wall between this family and every difficult thing that is coming for the rest of my life in a way that makes it impossible for me to also have a life. I should have told you that a long time ago. I should have told you when I was 25. I did not, because I did not know how to say it then, and because saying it felt like abandoning you, and because I have spent 20 years understanding what I owe this family and almost no time understanding what I am also allowed to want. I want this. I have wanted it for years. I am finally allowing myself to have it. I stopped talking. What followed was not a scene. I want to be clear about that because I know that in a story like this one, the expectation is a scene. Tears and accusations and the dramatic clearing of the air in one cathartic evening. That is not what happened. What happened was something quieter and more lasting. My mother cried. She did not say anything for a long time. When she spoke, she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She spoke, he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said it without accusation, without the inflection of someone who was hurt by the withholding. She said it as a genuine question, the question of someone who is trying to understand something she had not previously been equipped to understand. "Why didn't you tell me you were carrying all of this?" I said, "Because you needed me to carry it, and I didn't know how to tell you I was carrying it without you feeling like it was your fault." She said, "It is my fault." "Some of it." I said, "Some, not all. Some of it is mine." I kept taking things on without saying out loud what the taking on was costing. That's a choice I made, and it had consequences, and I own them. She nodded. She said, "I didn't know about Marco's programs, the full extent of what you paid." "No," I said. "I didn't want you to know, because I didn't want you to feel the guilt of it." She said, "That was not your decision to make for me." "I know," I said. "You're right. That exchange is the one I replay most often. Not because it resolved anything, but because it was the most honest conversation my mother and I had ever had in my adult life. Sitting at her kitchen table with cold food in front of us and my brother and sister both very quiet on either side. Marco spoke after a long silence. He said, "The rehab, the first one." He said it as a statement rather than a question, as if he was confirming something he had half known and not looked at directly. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to know the number." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I need to know the number." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I need to know." He put both hands on the table, flat, the way my mother does when she is grounding herself. He said, "I'm going to pay you back." He said it simply and with the specific quality of someone making a real commitment rather than a reflexive one. I said, "I know you are." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do." That was the whole conversation, and it was exactly sufficient. Cammy put down her phone, which she had not done since I started speaking, and which I realized she had put down approximately 30 seconds in and had been sitting in silence for the rest of it. She said, "I didn't know." About the tuition. She said, "I thought it was loans and the grant." I said, "There were loans and a grant and a gap." Cammy said, "How big?" I told her. She sat with the number for a moment. Then she said, quietly and without drama and with a seriousness I was not entirely expecting from her, "I'm going to do something with it. With the degree. I'm going to make it mean something. That's the only way I know how to respond to this." I believed her. For the first time in Cammy's adult life, I believed her completely. The evening ended the way real evenings end, which is slowly and imperfectly and without a ribbon on it. My mother reheated the food I had brought, and we ate it at the table, mostly in silence, with the occasional short exchange. Marco asked a question about Geneva's time zone relative to DC, which was the most practical question anyone had ever asked me about the fellowship, and which made me feel a tie. Specific warmth toward him. Cammy asked whether I had ever been to Switzerland before. I said once for a conference, for 4 days, and I had not seen much of it. She said, "You'll have 3 years. You'll see everything." She said it with a simplicity that was better than anything more elaborate would have been. When I left, my mother stood in the doorway. She did not say everything she was thinking. My mother never does in the moment. She processes and then she calls. But she stood in the doorway and she held me, and when she let go, she looked at my face the way she has looked at it since I was small, with the full attention of a woman who has always been paying closer attention than I gave her credit for. She said, "I'm proud of you." She said it plainly, without ceremony. "I'm proud of who you are, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you that more clearly when you needed to hear it. I'm telling you now." She paused. "Go to Geneva, Mija. Go." The individual conversations that happened in the weeks after the dinner were the ones that did the real work of the thing, in the way that the declaration is only the beginning and the living into is what actually matters. Marco called me 3 days after the dinner. He called at 7 in the morning, which is when Marco thinks best, and he said he had been talking to his sponsor about what I'd shared at the dinner. He said his sponsor had said something that he kept thinking about, which was that accepting help without accounting for it is something you have to stop doing if you want to be in real relationships, because real relationships require accurate accounting. He said, "I didn't know you paid for what you paid for. I had guesses, but I told myself the guesses were probably wrong. They weren't." He said, "I'm going to pay you back, and I want to do it formally, with a schedule, so that it's real and not just a thing I said." I said, "Okay." We spent 45 minutes on that call, building the structure of it, which Marco took notes on, which was how I knew he meant it the way he said it. Cami and I had the longer conversation, the one I had told the dinner table I owed her. She came to my apartment on a Saturday 2 weeks after the dinner, and I made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table, and I told her the full picture of the tuition contributions, the amounts, the timeline, the way it had interacted with my own budget over 4 years. She listened with an attention that I had not always associated with Cami and that I understood. Watching her, she had probably always been capable of, and that I had not always given her the room to demonstrate. When I finished, she said, "I want to know something." She said, "Did you do it because you felt like you had to, or because you wanted to?" I thought about it honestly. I said both. The wanting was real. The feeling of having to was also real. They were the same thing for a long time, and I'm still working out which one was driving at any given moment. She nodded. She said, "I'm going to be worth it. Not for you, for me. Because I want to be someone who is worth the investment people made in me." I said, "You already are." She said, "I'm working on it." That was the more honest answer, and I respected it. My mother called 6 days after the dinner in the evening, which is when Rosa Moreno calls when she has been thinking and is ready to say the thing she was thinking. She said she had been sitting with what I had shared about the financial contributions, the years of them, the amounts. She said, "I want you to know that I am not going to pretend I didn't know something was being carried. I knew. I didn't know the shape of it, but I knew weight was being carried, and I let you carry it because you were capable of carrying it and because I was afraid of what it would look like if I made you put it down." She said, "That is not something I'm proud of." I said, "I know you weren't trying to take advantage of me." She said, "I know I wasn't trying to. I'm also aware that what we try to do and what we actually do are two different things, and I've been sitting with the gap between them." She said, "Tell me what you need from me while you're in Geneva. Not what you think is reasonable to ask for. What you actually need." I told her. It was a shorter list than she expected, and I think shorter than she expected meant that what I needed from her was not material but present, and I could see her receive that and adjust to it in the way she adjusted to things she understood mattered. I want to spend some time here on the honest reflection, because I think this story only earns its telling if I am willing to say the complicated parts as well as the clear ones. I did not have to carry what I carried in silence for 20 years. I made choices, repeatedly and with some awareness, to carry more than was mine alone to hold, and to do it without saying out loud what it was costing. I made those choices partly from love, which is true and real, and partly from a belief that this was what it meant to be the oldest, the capable one, the one who holds things. And that belief had been so embedded in my identity for so long that questioning it felt less like exercising a choice and more like dismantling something foundational. Who was I if not the person this family leaned on? I had organized my entire adult life around that question, and I had never, until the year of the fellowship, been willing to ask whether the answer served me or only served the question. The answer, it turns out, was both. I am genuinely someone who loves her family and who has found deep meaning in the giving. That is true. And I am also someone who used the giving as a substitute for the terrifying work of deciding what I wanted for myself, because the giving was always available and always needed and always carried the specific, immediate reward of being necessary to people I loved. The wants for myself, Geneva, the fellowship, the work that was mine and not the family's, required something different. They required me to hold the wanting without a guaranteed return, without the immediate reward of being needed, without the identity of the one who holds things. They required me to be a person whose primary orientation was toward her own life. That is not something I had ever practiced. It is something I am learning. I leave for Geneva in 6 weeks. The practical arrangements are largely in place. My mother has met with the patient advocate, who she describes as very organized, which from my mother is high praise. The financial assistance program has been applied for, and initial approval has come through. Marco and I have had 2 conversations about the repayment, both of which were direct and real and which I believe will be honored. Cami has gotten a job offer in her field and is preparing for the first apartment of her life, which is something I am watching with the specific satisfaction of someone who invested in something and is seeing it finally, fully land. My mother and I talk differently now than we did before the April dinner. Not more often, though we do talk more often. Differently, with the quality of 2 people who have agreed, implicitly and without ceremony, to be more honest with each other about what is actually happening. She asks me real questions. She tells me real things about her health, her concerns, the things she is afraid of, instead of the managed versions she had been offering to protect me from worrying. I tell her about the fellowship, about what I am excited for, about Geneva in ways that allow her to be happy for me rather than managing her reaction to something I've been careful not to say. These conversations feel like the ones we should have been having for years. I am not sure we were capable of them before the April dinner. I think we may have needed the truth to be said plainly in a kitchen over cold food before we could start building the version of the relationship that could hold it. Let me close with something I had been carrying since the February morning in the car when the almost fell away and I understood that I was going. There is a particular kind of loss that happens to people who give everything to others before they have given anything to themselves, and it is not the loss of what was given. The giving, when it comes from love, rarely feels like a loss at the time. The loss is quieter than that. It is the accumulation of unclaimed things, the trips not taken, the relationships not fully entered, the opportunities that came and were declined in favor of the available need, the version of yourself that existed only in the space between what you did for others and what you might have done for yourself, a version that never quite got the chance to become fully real. I am not grieving my 20s and my early 30s, and I will not perform that grief for the sake of a compelling close to this story. What I gave in those years was real and it mattered, and the people it went to are better for it in ways that are observable and ongoing. Marco is 4 years sober. Cami has a degree and a job offer and is becoming someone I am proud to know. My mother has an extra layer of care around her health than she would have had without what I organized and funded. These are not small things. I do not regret them. What I want to say instead of grief is this. The choosing is not binary. It was never actually a choice between the family and myself. It only felt that way because I had been running those 2 things in opposition for so long that opposition was the only relationship they knew how to have with each other. The fellowship and the family can exist at the same time. The care I have for my mother and the career I have been working toward are not competitors. I made them competitors by accepting a framework that required one to be sacrificed for the other, and then I lived inside that framework for 20 years, and then I finally set it down. Geneva is in 6 weeks. I have been thinking about it in a specific and quiet way in the weeks since the dinner, not with the anxious processing I spent 12 months doing before I said anything, but with something that feels more like anticipation, which is an emotion I had nearly forgotten the texture of. I am going to arrive in a city where no one has an expectation of me that predates this moment, where the role I carry is the one I chose and not the one I stepped into because the position was open and I was standing close to it. I will be, for the first time in 20 years, primarily someone who is doing a thing she chose rather than someone who is managing a thing the family needs. I will call my mother on Sundays. This is not a compromise or a concession. It is the thing I want to do because my mother is someone I love talking to when the conversation is honest, and the conversations have been honest in a new way since April. I will send Marco the contact for the financial counselor and I will check in with him. Not to monitor, but because he is my brother and 4 years sober and becoming someone worth knowing in the full dimension of what that means. I will be at Cammie's first apartment in some form remotely, if not physically, because that moment matters and I want to be inside it with her. The family is not something I am leaving. The role I was playing inside it is what I am leaving. The distinction is not small. And I will, for the first time in a very long time, have the sustained space to discover who I am when I am the primary thing I am responsible for. When the giving is voluntary rather than assumed. When the life I am building is oriented toward my own horizon and not arranged entirely around the needs of the people I love. I do not know exactly who that person is. I know she has always been here, in the margins of the life I have been living, showing up in the fellowship applications and the deferred trips to Portugal and the evenings when I close the door of my apartment and let myself want something out loud before going back to managing everything else. I'm going to meet her properly in Geneva, and the work that is mine, in the city I chose. I think I am going to like what I find. If this story found you tonight, if you are the one this family leans on, the one who has been giving from a place so deep, it has started to feel like the place itself, the one who has something hidden that you have been waiting for the right moment to say, I want to say something to you directly, and, without softening it, the moment you are waiting for is not coming. The right moment is the moment you decide to make it. Not perfectly. Not when everything is arranged and everyone is ready, not when the circumstances have aligned to make the saying of it gentle enough for everyone in the room. The right moment is a Sunday dinner table and a hand on yours and a sentence about moving in, and it is the moment you set down your fork and say before we talk about that, what you have been hiding deserves to be said, not because your family will immediately understand it or immediately accept it or immediately reorganize their expectations to accommodate it. They may not at first. My family did not fully in that one evening, but the saying of it opens a door that the silence keeps permanently closed, and on the other side of that door is the version of the relationship your family is actually capable of having with you, not the one built on what you've been providing, but the one built on who you actually are. That version is worth the dinner table. It is worth every dinner table it takes to get there. Tell me in the comments where you are in this. Tell me what you've been hiding and how long you've been holding it. Tell me if you've had your dinner table moment or if you're still waiting for the right one. I read everything. And if someone in your life needs permission tonight to finally say the thing, share this. You might be the reason they set down their fork. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.